$10, maybe less. They sat on the table beside a small, neatly wrapped box I hadn't opened yet. Across from me, my daughter Amelia laughed brightly, a sound that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. Next to her, her husband, Mark, strapped a gleaming Rolex onto his wrist. The steel caught the light from the chandelier and he admired it, turning his arm this way and that. It was a gift from Amelia, she'd announced to the whole table, for all his hard work. The watch cost more than I had spent on my first house. The socks were for me, I just smiled. Mark patted my shoulder with a casual, almost dismissive gesture. Great socks, Pop. Amelia knows you love a good bargain. His words were a knife, twisted with a saccharine smile. Amelia nodded in agreement, her eyes apathetic, already focused on the next course. She had long forgotten the man who had worked 2 jobs to send her to college, who had fixed her first car with his bare hands, who had spent decades of his life building a successful small-engine repair business from nothing. My good bargain was her way of telling me I was a good-for-nothing. The dinner had been a spectacle of their self-absorption. They talked about their extravagant vacation plans, their new, impossibly expensive SUV, and the socialite friends they had been cultivating. My life, my quiet, dignified life in the home I had built, was a footnote, a fading memory of a past they were trying desperately to escape. They saw me not as a father, but as a bank account with a pulse, a source of funds that was becoming increasingly inconvenient to access. For years I had tolerated their avarice, their condescension. I had written checks for their emergencies that were, in reality, frivolous expenditures. I had co-signed on loans I shouldn't have. I had swallowed my pride and kept quiet, but as I sat there holding my coarse gray socks, watching the glint of Mark's new watch, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been too simple. It was a cold, hard clarity. It was a realization that my patience had been mistaken for weakness, my love for naivete. They saw me as a fool, a fading old man they could manipulate for the final prize. My estate. Amelia's voice broke through my thoughts. Dad, don't forget the trust fund papers you need to sign. Mark and I want to make sure your assets are, managed properly. Managed, she meant by them. We'll stop by next week. I looked her in the eyes, my smile unwavering. Of course, dear, I said, my voice calm. I'll be ready. They had no idea. The very next day, I called my old friend, a lawyer named Robert. Robert had been my attorney for nearly 40 years, handling everything from my business contracts to the details of my will. It's time, Robert, I said, my voice low and steady. It's time to start over. And this time, I'm not just fixing an engine, I'm rebuilding the entire car. The plan began with a phone call, a quiet walk to the bank, and a single, deliberate email. They thought I was slow, uneducated, and easily swayed. They saw my worn hands and assumed they were a sign of a simple mind. But those hands had built a life, and now they were preparing to dismantle theirs. The socks and the watch weren't just gifts. They were a declaration of war, and I, the old fool, was about to become the silent general. The war they didn't realize had already begun. They were so busy counting their winnings they never noticed the chess pieces moving on the board. Over the next few weeks I moved with the quiet efficiency of a man on a mission. Amelia and Mark, predictably, were too engrossed in their own lives to notice. Amelia called not to check on me but to remind me about the trust fund papers. Dad, we're thinking of remodeling the kitchen. That's a good investment, right? It would be so much easier if the estate was sorted out. I listened patiently, occasionally interjecting with a vague, yes, dear, or that's a good idea. I let her think she was in control. My feigned docility was the perfect camouflage. Meanwhile, I met with Robert almost daily. My will, the one they had a copy of, was a forgery. It had been from the moment I suspected their motives years ago. A small, almost paranoid safeguard, but a vital one. Robert and I had been working on a new legal framework, a masterpiece of quiet vengeance. It was a multi-pronged attack. First, I sold my old repair shop, not to a large corporation as they had hoped, but to my longtime employee, a good man named David. The price was significantly lower, but the terms were favorable, and the money went into a new, discreet account that was legally untouchable by any future claims. The shop was David's now, a legacy I was proud of, safe from Amelia and Mark's greedy clutches. Next came the house. They had always referred to it as the inheritance, the physical embodiment of their future wealth. I signed the deed over to a newly formed nonprofit foundation, one dedicated to providing vocational training for young people. I retained a lifetime tenancy, of course. The house was no longer an asset. It was a charitable institution. The move was perfectly legal, airtight. When Amelia mentioned their plans to flip the house once it was theirs, I simply nodded and said, "It's a good place, full of memories." Their arrogance only grew. One evening, Mark called, his voice oily with false concern. "Pop, have you thought about moving to a nice retirement community? One of those places with a nurse on call? You know, for your health." He was trying to get me out of the house, out of the way. I knew what he really meant. "Get out so we can sell it," I responded with a calm, "I'm perfectly happy here, son, but thank you for your concern." He hung up, a frustrated huff audible before the dial tone. They were so close to their prize they could almost taste it. Then the small tremors began. The first was a phone call from Amelia, her voice laced with confusion. "Dad," the bank called. "They said there was a small technical issue with the account we're linked to." "What's going on?" I had, with Robert's guidance, quietly severed all joint financial ties. I had closed the accounts I had helped them set up and moved my funds into a new private trust. "Oh, that old account," I said, a playful tone in my voice. "The bank said it was time for an upgrade. I just moved everything over." She didn't press. She still believed she could just get the new account information from me later. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with an international wire transfer and a carefully orchestrated sale of the last of my liquid assets, all of it to a small, private charity fund I had established. The money was now out of their reach. Forever. They thought I was a simple man who saved his money in a shoebox. They had no idea I had been a voracious reader of financial law for years, a self-taught master of legal loopholes. The day before the final meeting, Amelia called again. "Dad, we're coming over tomorrow to sign the papers. You have all of them ready, right?" I held the phone, a serene silence on my end. I pictured the watch on Mark's wrist, the scratchy socks in my drawer, and the years of disrespect I had endured. "Oh, the papers," I said. "Yes, they're all ready. And Amelia, don't worry about coming over. I've already taken care of everything." The line went dead. My phone began to ring again and again and again. It was Amelia. She called 17 times. I let it ring. The calm, calculated smile returned to my face. The clock was ticking and their time had just run out. The silence after the 17th call was deafening. It was a strange, beautiful silence, pregnant with the fury I knew was to come. It came an hour later, in the form of Amelia and Mark pounding on my front door. Their faces were ashen, a mixture of panic and disbelief. "Dad, open up!" Amelia screamed, her voice hoarse. "What did you do?" I opened the door slowly, calmly. I was sitting at my desk, a cup of tea in my hand. "Come in," I said, gesturing to the empty chairs. "We have a lot to discuss." They stormed in, their polished facade shattered. Mark's face was a mask of pure rage. "The bank said you closed our joint accounts. The lawyer called about the house deed. What is the meaning of this, old man?" I took a slow sip of my tea. "It means," I said, my voice a soft counterpoint to their hysteria, "that I've taken back what is mine." But the will," Amelia stammered, her hands trembling. "You promised you'd sign the new one, the one with the trust fund." I smiled, a real smile this time, one that didn't reach my eyes. "The will you have a copy of," I explained, "was an old, unofficial draft. It was a nice piece of fiction, wasn't it? The real one, the legally binding one, was filed with the state this morning." I gestured to a neatly stacked pile of documents on my desk. "The will now states that my estate, including all my assets, properties, and liquid funds, will be held in trust for the foundation I've created. After my death, the money will be used to fund scholarships for young people pursuing a trade. The house is already part of that foundation." The room fell into an unearthly silence. Mark's jaw hung open. Amelia's face, which had been contorted with rage, went stark white. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, sickly hue. She swayed slightly, as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. No, you can't," she whispered, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. "That's everything. That's our future." "Your future," I corrected gently, "was never mine to give. It was yours to build. And you chose to build it on the shaky foundation of my generosity, instead of your own hard work." The irony was delicious. They had mocked my hard work, my self-made success, and now they were left with nothing. The unraveling was swift and brutal. Mark, who had relied on my generosity to keep his floundering business afloat, found his credit line suddenly cut. Amelia, whose spending habits were predicated on a future inheritance, was now facing down a mountain of debt with no bailout plan. The public exposure was the final blow. I had sent a copy of my will and a short letter to the local newspaper. The headline the next day was a masterpiece of poetic justice. "Local entrepreneur gives all to charity, after family's disrespectful Father's Day gift. The article detailed my story, the socks, the watch, and the final decision. The repercussions were immediate. Their social circle turned its back on them. Their friends, who had been so happy to bask in the glow of their supposed wealth, disappeared. Their lives, built on a lie, had crumbled. In the end, I wasn't alone. I had the satisfaction of watching my life's work go to a cause I believed in, a cause that mirrored my own journey. I had also found a new kind of family in the people who respected and admired my decision. A new chapter had begun for me, one of quiet contentment and dignity. Amelia and Mark, on the other hand, had their own new beginning. A new beginning filled with desperation, debt, and the bitter taste of what they had lost. They had called me a fool. But as I sat on my porch enjoying the quiet morning sun, I knew who the true fool was. The socks had been the cheapest thing on that table, but they had cost them everything. And for that, there was too late to regret.